Some faced opposition from husbands, fathers, brothers and leaders in the movement. They were taking on the might of a police state after all. Well, they came anyway. Mostly black African women, but also Indian, coloured and white women, they came. They assembled at the seat of apartheid POWA, 20,000 strong, to tell the racist state that they, as the women of the country, would no longer bend under the yoke of the past laws. They stared naked raw power in the face, and they won. That was the 9th of August 1956, and that is why we observe National Women's Day. Yet, 62 years later, we must ask the question, have we lived up to the ideal they fought for, or have we as a society failed the marchers of that historic day? Welcome to On the Record, our weekly segment here on The Full View, in which we discuss and debate the issues at the top of the news agenda. My guests tonight are Fatima Shabuddin, who's a gender activist. We're also joined by Lulama Nare, the chairperson of the Gender Commission. We'll also have Lisa Vetten from POWA. And a little later on, we'll be joined in our Cape Town studios by Seeham Samaai in our Sea Point studios. Good evening to you, ladies. And I can't quite say a happy Women's Day, can I? Because it's not a happy one, is it?
No, it isn't.
I mean, it's a day in which we should be able to reflect on the history, that historic march, that brave stance that was taken by those women without the benefits and the conveniences of modern communications. But it's a day on which many women across the country are still vulnerable, are still exposed, and are really facing an onslaught from the men of this country. Have we failed the women of 1956?
I think we failed the women dismally of 1950s and also the women today of South Africa. I think we're living through a massive pandemic of violence against women. There's a literal war on our bodies, and it doesn't feel as if anybody has recognized that there's a crisis of this magnitude happening, playing itself out in front of our eyes.
Lulama, we've got great legislation, we've got great policies, we've got the Gender Commission. Why are we still here? Why have the gains that we've made in terms of our constitutional framework not translated into the lived experiences of women in this country?
I think for me it's a mixed day, because as a black woman, I know that I am far, far away from where the 1956 women were. And I think that there has been developments in terms of my status as a woman. I think that one of the things that has happened is the backlash against gender equality, and that many people will come up with various concepts that speak against the equality. So with women, there is a question at the moment, why should they be equal to men? Why do we think that they are equal to men? We will show them their place. This is their place and this is where they should remain. And I think in the main for me is patriarchy.
We're far from where the women of 56, as Lulama says, Lisa. And of course, we saw just last week with the total shutdown campaign that the spirit of 56 in some ways is still very much alive.
Yes, and I think we face different historical and political conditions now to those that were faced 62 years ago. So it's difficult to compare, because if you read the charter, that the first women's charter developed in 1955, the set of demands are very different to those that were developed by the Women's Charter of 1994. So you can see that there has been a shift. I think the challenge to us is that we haven't perhaps, as feminists, as activists, thought carefully enough about the state, what role it can play, what role it can't play, around questions of implementation and how we use the state's power and when we stay away from the state, because it has different interests that are not necessarily coterminous or in support necessarily of an activist women's agenda.
Right, you are watching On the Record. It's our weekly segment here on The Full View, in which we debate and discuss the pertinent issues of the day. Well, we are joined now from our Sea Point studios in Cape Town. Of course, we've got a panel discussion here in Johannesburg, but in Cape Town now we go to Seeham Samaai, who's in our Cape Town studios. Good evening to you, and thank you for being part of our panel this evening. The President spoke in Cape Town. Once again, he said all the right things, but is it necessarily translating to what women are experiencing on a daily basis?
Good evening to everyone, and thank you for having the Women's Legal Centre. That is the challenge that we have, is that implementation of the laws is a massive problem for women on the ground. Most of those policies as well as legislation don't take into account the lived realities of those women and the different intersectional forms of discrimination which they go through the criminal justice system. And I think that is some of the problems that we do have with the system. It doesn't take into account those multi-level forms of discrimination. When women go to the courts, there are different levels of secondary victimization because the women or the victims are not centered in relation to the criminal justice system. And from the Women's Legal Centre side, we try to, through our cases, to be able to bring forth those type of intersectional forms of discrimination in terms of the laws as well as the policies. So it's one thing to speak about what they're doing, but the other challenge that we're sitting with is that from the highest office to the lowest clerk within the criminal justice system, we see that there is a lack of implementation. And how that looks is that people don't see the criminal justice system as a form of social change, or they don't see the law as a form of social change, because the system in itself is a form of oppression. And we need to be able to see how is it that we can make the laws and policies reflect the lived realities of women on the ground.
Fatima, let me bring you back into the conversation. I mean, the legal system sometimes is seen as part of the problem, what fails women. We've got a roll call of horror, I call it. The names are too familiar, I'm afraid, from Riva Steenkamp to Zanele Khumalo to Karabo Mokoena. This problem of intimate partner violence, it cuts across social, class divides, race divides. Anybody can be affected.
Absolutely. And for us, I mean, part of the conversation is the conversation about the weaknesses in the legal system, but remember, the criminal justice system is the response, is what happens after you've been violated. And so while we must focus on that and the problems that's in that system, a big part of our conversation has got to be what makes it so widespread, what makes it so normal for men in our country to kill and maim women. And it's not strangers. We don't get killed when we cross a dark corner, although that happens too. I think it's important for us to remember that the majority of women who die in this country die at the hands of people we know and love. So there aren't enough jails in this country to lock up every man who has violated a woman. And what we really need to have a conversation about is the disconnect between our constitutional values and the values that prevail on the ground. So for me, one of the biggest failures in our post-apartheid era is a failure to invest in value shifting. We've not tried to create a set of values that's embodied in our constitution, the values of non-racism, the values of non-sexism. We wrote this beautiful constitution. People come from all over the world to study our legislative framework because it's so exemplary. But what exists on the ground is normative values of discrimination. And so we need an education system that shifts that. We need a public broadcaster that actually invests in the public campaign to teach men that if you make children, you must raise children. If you sleep in a bed, you have to make a bed. Because the values of patriarchy starts exactly right there, and we've not done much about that.
There was also this sense, Lulama, that we attained political freedom, but that really the issues affecting women, gender issues, were almost secondary on a number of lists, rather on a hierarchy of issues that the country faced. And that's now why we find ourselves at this point.
I tend to agree with that. But most interestingly enough is that even the political body is that one that doesn't also believe in gender transformation. So they say, but the work is different. And that is why the implementation is a problem.
But the political parties will argue and say, look, we've got we're so well represented, for example, in Parliament. We've got all this legislation, as we've discussed already here on this evening's discussion. It's not their fault, they might say.
Our research as the Gender Commission on Political Party Representation is talking the opposite. So there are political parties with the zebra approach, one male, one female, and then there are political parties who are equal participation, equal opportunities, and then there are other political parties where it depends on the whim, and most of them depend on the whim. Most of our opposition parties depend on the will of the head of that political party. But the ones who have a zebra approach also, they decide excluding women and keep them at the bottom of the list so that by the time they get the influential positions, women are excluded.
Or even when they do have those influential positions, they really are proxies for battles between men. Isn't that the case?
It's the case, and our research is very clear. Political parties, they do not walk the talk.
So political parties aren't walking the talk. We need to have a conversation as a society, Lisa. But also violence. I mean, we can talk all we want about broader issues, right? But violence against women. I mean, this very day we buried this third-year student from Rhodes University, and again at the center of the reason why she took her life is the issue of rape.
Yeah, I'm fine.
There was a startling question which was asked last week. Why are women hated so much?
You know, I think there's certainly, if we look at how extreme the violence is, there certainly is a strong sense that there's hatred. But I think if we look at it more psychologically and we start to look at where do these men come from? What is it that shapes them? We're going to have to shift, I think, some of our approaches in a way that starts to understand, without excusing men's behavior, where they come from. And unfortunately, if you look at a lot of the research, I mean, I'm just thinking of some research I did interviewing men who'd killed their partners. They themselves come from very difficult histories. It doesn't excuse them. But I think precisely because they are themselves quite damaged, simply saying to them, stop that right now, that's terrible, you've got to stop it, is not going to be enough. And I think what we are making a mistake is investing in these half-hour dialogues, these 3-hour little chats, which are not going to be deep enough to change some men who have very deep problems. So I would like us to start taking a much more complex understanding to violence if we want to address it. Because if there's one thing that the research is very clear on, it's that men who have been victimized are more likely to go on to commit violence, not only towards women, but towards each other. So I think when we look at the problem of violence against women, we have to look not only at men's violence towards women, but also to themselves.
Is it about violence in this society, given our particular history? I mean, there's a lot of trauma that's not been resolved. Is that part of the issue?
That's part of it, but it's certainly not the whole explanation. And we can't lose sight of the fact that violence is gendered. So we can't talk about violence in general. We must talk about how it affects men and women in very different ways. But if we just focus on violence against women, men's violence towards women, we are still leaving masculinity and its connection to violence completely intact, because we're not saying the fact that you beat up each other and murder each other at rates 3 times the rates you murder women is a problem. And in a way, that's quite a conservative position, because it's reinforcing the idea that women are more delicate and fragile and men shouldn't hit them because they're more delicate and fragile. But if they carry on beating each other up, that's just fine. What we have to do is challenge the way masculinity has been attached to violence, and the way it takes particular shapes in relation to violence towards women, and the way it takes shapes in particular ways towards violence towards men. And I think if we try and look at that relationship between masculinity and violence, that will perhaps take us more and perhaps be somewhat more gender transformative than just putting out messages like, oh, men must protect women, men must fulfill their natural role of looking after women. That again suggests that women are weaker and they need men's protection. Actually, the people they need protection from are men.
Because certainly we can't keep on, business as usual, looking at the next horrific headline, and we wait for the next, and we are shocked thereafter, but actually nothing concrete changes. All right, let me bring Seeham back into the conversation. If we look at it from a legal point of view, I mean, there's also some discussion that needs to be had about how the legal system works. For example, the idea that a perpetrator may be acquitted doesn't necessarily mean the rape, for example, didn't happen.
Yes, can I just, one of the major challenges that we do have is that the rate of sexual violence or the amount of sexual violence is quite high. But we do know that there's also a huge amount of women or victims that are not coming forward and actually laying charges or actually going through the criminal justice system. So when we speak about the rate of the rate that perpetrators are found guilty, etc., we also need to look at that in the context of women actually not coming forward. In addition to that, going through the criminal justice system, there's also a high rate of cases not being finalized and matters being withdrawn. And that is also because of the secondary victimization which women go through the particular system. And we need to be able to look at that. How do we support women through the criminal justice system? Because we believe that if women are supported through the system, that the rate will be much higher, because they will be able to either deal with the vigor of the criminal justice system and also be able to deal with the psychological trauma, which is before the person comes into the system and when the person goes through the system and even after that. And the problem that we're sitting with is that there isn't enough psychological as well as mental support for victims of violence. And how do we assist women to be able to get through the system if those systems are not there? We also need support like shelters. We need support in terms of housing. We need support in terms of psychosocial support for women, because we do know that when they go through gender-based violence, all forms of gender-based violence, the challenge is that they need additional support to ensure that they are assisted through that particular system.
Right, one of the issues we need to discuss as the panel this evening is the idea of objective truth. The legal system, of course, you'll know, was designed mostly from the perspective of men, for the benefit of men. How does that play a role? Can the truth always be objective? Stay with us. We've got more on our discussion after this break.
SABC News celebrates Women's Month.
You fired! Unfair dismissal. Car accident. Court appearance. Let Trantel Legal tackle your legal problems. Whether it is a car accident, unfair dismissal, uncontested divorce, unfair blacklisting, or a wrongful arrest, we have tough professional lawyers standing by to assist you.
With the help of Trantel Legal, I kept my job and I can support my family.
I definitely got value for money. It didn't cost me a cent, just my monthly premium.
There was one man with his lawyer against a big bank and I won.
Car accident. Faulty goods or bad service? You fired! Unfair dismissal.
No matter how big or small your legal problems, don't tackle them by yourself. Trantel Legal will do the tough work for you. SMS RIGHT to 32281 and we'll call you back.
The march of this union building in 1956 by 20,000 women was not only the extension of the carrying of passes to African women, but also about the challenges and the oppressive system that sought to deepen the inequalities in terms of race and gender.
SABC News celebrates Women's Month.